Whether we're talking about developmental line editing or any part of the editorial process, your editor is your partner in making your book, because it's your name on the cover, as good as it can be. The editor recedes into the background and is not imposing their vision of the book separate from your vision. The editor is seeing your vision and saying, how do we make it even better?
Welcome to the Curious Cat Bookshop podcast, the podcast of the independent bookstore of Winsted, Connecticut, creating a literary community in Northwest Connecticut, bringing our local authors to the world and the world to our community in Northwest Connecticut.
Hello and welcome to the Curious Cat Bookshop podcast. I'm Stacy Whitman. I'm your host and the owner of the Curious Cat Bookshop, and I'm also a publishing professional. And just to give you a little bit of background, I have been publishing and editing children's books for more than 20 years, and I have a master's in children's literature from Simmons University. At the time, it was Simmons College. I have worked in trade magazines and newspapers and at educational publishers, and I once transcribed Overland Trails journals in a special collections of a university library. I've been working in books and publishing since my college days in the mid-90s. I've seen every part of this bookmaking process. We can talk about it from the beginning, the writing process, all the way through to how does a book get into a bookstore after it's finished. We can talk about that whole process. And today we're going to overview that, and then we're going to go deep into each part of the process as a part of this series on our podcast. Part of that is something we're already doing. You can look at any of our interviews with authors on this channel or on our audio podcast if you're listening to this in audio, because we're already talking to writers about their inspiration and their writing process. And everybody has a different process when it comes to that. Some work with writing groups, and some of them work alone, and some of them have beta readers. So let's start with the writing process. The writing process has an ideation phase. It has an outlining phase or a write from the seat of your pants phase. It has a figuring out what you want your story to be and then finishing it. So that is a very quick summary of what can be a very long process. I've talked to writers who have taken 10 years or more to write one book. I've worked with writers who've written an entire book in a month. That is quite a feat. And then, they've taken the time to revise it. And so you've got the writing process, the revision process, which is part of the writing process. The revision process is still prior to the publication process. The writing process and the revision process are all the writer, and the writer might be working with people to help them to get it ready for publication before they are submitting to an agent or putting it into the actual publication process. But I'm going to separate that out here. This is a timeline of writing, publication, and then we break up the publication process. The publication process starts with a moment of decision. Are you going to submit your book to an agent or to a small publisher who might be taking unagented submissions, there are fewer and fewer of those these days who are actually legitimate publishers. So I want you to be very wary of anyone who asks for money in the publication process. Anyone who says, I can get you published, but pay me $30,000. I can get you published, but whatever amount of fee for the editing. You can hire an editor as part of the process, a part of your writing process, a part of your getting ready for submission process. That is very legitimate. But I have a cat fight going on behind me. But there's a big difference between you deciding I need to work with an editor and a publishing house promising publication, but demanding money for it, whether in the form of upfront payments for editorial or marketing, or that their contract specifies that you should be buying a certain number of author copies, because then that means that they are making their money not from selling your book, but from you. And here is where I recommend so highly the website from SFWA, the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America, their Writer Beware website. It's a blog run by Victoria Strauss, and she really gets into all the scammers in publishing, both agents and publishing companies, quote unquote, that are taking advantage of writers' desire to be published. You should never, ever pay for the process of publication unless you are the publisher. And by that, I mean you are a self-publisher, and so you might pay for services like editorial or marketing because you have decided to be the publisher versus somebody saying, I'm going to be your traditional publisher, but pay me. Guys, stop it. So that moment of decision after you're done with the writing process of, do I submit to an agent or do I go self-publishing? That is a fork in the road. And you might decide later, you've gone through the agenting process or the submission process. Maybe you've even gotten an agent but not sold the book. You might still decide to self-publish later. So obviously these are not a completely binary choice here, but there are two parts of the publishing process. And I'm going to be talking about the traditional publishing process. And so when I warn you that if anybody in that process is saying, oh, by the way, the only way that this is going to happen is if you pay us money for it, that's a major red flag, and I want you to walk away. So if you are going to the traditional publishing route, you are going to have access to a lot of things that many self-publishers do not have access to. And that is, once your book is ready to be submitted to the professional review journals like Publishers Weekly, Library Journal, School Library Journal, that process of sending a book out for review to professional reviewers, even the New York Times, is going to be more accessible to you via a traditional publisher. Not completely inaccessible to self-publishers, but more accessible to you as a traditionally published author. Also in traditional publishing, especially in children's literature, you have more access to schools and libraries and even bookstores in a more formal and systematic way, because those traditional publishers should have a system of salespeople, catalogs, and other ways of reaching everyone who is buying books, as opposed to you having to create that system yourself. So those are two of the advantages that I'm going to be talking about as part of this whole process. That is not to say that it's an illegitimate way to publish, to self-publish, but there are choices and considerations that authors have to make at that moment that they're taking into consideration. Well, do I want access to this, or am I writing something with extreme local interest, so it's a smaller audience and it might not be picked up by a large publisher? Am I writing a very popular genre like romance and romantasy, where maybe I don't even need a traditional publisher? There are many, many really big authors who started out as self-publishers in those genres that are now getting traditionally published by, for example, Bloom is an imprint at Source Books that picks up those authors in ways that becomes kind of a hybrid, that they are able to keep the rights that they want to keep, and the publisher gives them access to those things that we just talked about. So after you've gone through that decision process and you've gotten an agent, and that agent has been great and they have sent your book out to all the different publishers, we'll talk about the agenting process in depth at another time, but this is just giving you an overview. That's what happens with a good agent. They're like, yes, I know exactly who to send this to. They send it out, and best case scenario, you get a lot of offers and your agent negotiates the whole thing and says, we have 3 offers, and you might even have a call with those editors to make your decision of who you're going to go with, who's going to be your publishing house, who's going to be your editor. And once the contract is signed, and sometimes that process takes quite a long time, be prepared for time and time and time. The publishing industry is kind of one of those hurry up and wait industries, I'm sorry to say, but that's what happens when art is made too. This is both art and a business. And when you're talking about art, you're talking about people, and human-made things do take time. So the thing about once you're in a publishing house, someone like me as the editor will have a number of projects that they're working on. And so they're constantly splitting their attention between this fire has to be put out because this thing is so timely and it has a deadline, and the deadline is here, and you've got to get the sell sheets out, or you've got to get this marketing material back to the marketing department or whatever. So, immediate needs, long-term needs, and you're acquiring new stuff that will go into this pipeline, and soon your book will be the fire that needs to be put out. So all that to say, it takes time in this process, so be prepared to be very patient. And that is another thing that sometimes when people are self-publishing, they're like, I just don't want to wait that long. I don't want to wait a couple of years for my book to be published. If you are writing something that has timely information, say, for example, an election. There are traditional publishing houses or imprints at those houses that do handle those things on a very fast basis. They're called crashed books. You'll see nonfiction that comes out in time just before an election that, has probably been written very fast and edited very fast. Those kinds of books are a different animal than the mostly fiction that I work on. So yes, those exist, but say you're working on something that's very timely, that you don't want to wait 2 or 3 years for it to come out. That is also a reason why someone might decide to self-publish. But getting back to what I was talking about, once you've gotten a signed contract, then we start the editorial process. And I want you to think of the editorial process as an upside down triangle, where you start with the big picture, all the biggest issues of any book. And let me pause to say, yes, you've gone through the whole writing and revision process and you think your book is as perfect as you can make it. And now the work begins. Because your editor is your advocate for you in the publishing house, and the right editor will have the vision for your book that makes your book so much better, because you should be on the same page with your editor, and your editor will be that first reader to your first professional reader who can say, hey, you know what? I love this so much. You know how we can take it to another level? What if you did this? What if this? What if? And so we're talking about that top of the inverted triangle where we're looking at plot holes. We're looking at characterization and how it can be stronger. We're looking at pacing. Maybe it's too slow. Maybe it's too fast. Maybe you need to slow down in this area and really savor the imagery that you've got going on, or slow down in this area and let us know what this looks like at all because it's gone by too fast. Maybe we need to work a little bit on world building, and I'm going to do a whole class on world building in about a month. So if you want to dive into the depths of world building as an author, I will be posting class information as we get that organized. I think we'll limit it to 25 seats because we want to have workshop time with each other. And so I'm going to be talking about I've basically developed a universal theory of world building. I can get into that in another time. That's what the class will be about. But say you need to enhance your world building in some way. And my universal theory of world building, let me tell you, is not just fantasy and science fiction. It applies to everything I've ever edited. But those are all very big picture problems that a book might have. And I am not going to be worried about a comma here or a phrase there that's going to be out of place if you're going to be excising an entire chapter or reworking an entire character. So everything on that level is very broad, very big picture. And once we've gotten through the developmental process, which it might be 1 pass, it might be 3 passes, it just depends on you and your editor, and whether everybody feels satisfied with it and the timeline that you've got and whether you've got deadlines to hit. Then after the developmental process, we go down into the triangle to a little bit closer to small picture. But medium picture is going to be your line editing phase. And I've had discussions with my British authors, which is really fascinating because if you're watching this from the UK and you're a professional author, you might be, what do you mean by line editing? Because apparently that's not really, I think it depends on the house, whether that's considered part of the process in other publishing companies. But here in the US, the line editing phase is where we are talking about like just line craft, paragraph, medium. So we're done with the larger picture of, all of the big stuff, but there will still be, hey, maybe you're repeating yourself here, or, these paragraphs don't seem to fit here. Maybe you should put it up here instead now that we've figured out the character. What if you rephrased it this way? And I'm going to make a note here that your editor is not a corrector. They're not going to be like, a teacher who's like, oh, you did this wrong. Your editor is a person who is asking questions as a professional reader. Hey, I didn't quite understand this thing here. What is going on here? And, oh, hey, I think we missed a detail. What's happening here? Or I think you've got too much detail here, too much explanation, and maybe you could shorten this up and get the plot moving again. Whether we're talking about developmental, line editing, or any part of the editorial process, your editor is your partner in making your book, because it's your name on the cover, as good as it can be. The editor recedes into the background and is not imposing their vision of the book separate from your vision. The editor is seeing your vision and saying, how do we make it even better? So that's line editing. Medium to fine grain, thinking about like big rocks up here, medium, fine grain, really fine tuning the book so that when it is a finished product, you can feel proud of it. You can get 4-starred reviews. You can really feel like it is the best book that you have made. And while all that is happening, we're getting into the line editing phase. The editor has been working with somebody else in the publishing company that you might not have been working with directly, and that is the design side of things. So the editor might ask for your feelings on what you'd like the cover to look like. They might then pass those things along with their own thoughts about, hey, this is where I see this in the market. This is Gigi, and she always has to be here at the desk while we work here. No matter what kind of book you're writing, your book cover is your number one piece of marketing for the book. The book cover is what gets somebody to pick it up off the shelf in a physical bookstore, or sees the thumbnail online and says, you know what? Interesting. This might be up my alley. Now, reviews help as well, and word of mouth recommendation, but the number one marketing piece that is produced by a publishing company is your cover. And so while the editorial process is getting to finer and finer detail, closer and closer to publication, the design process is a parallel process that's happening at the same time. And so your editor is working with the design department to have them create, or an illustrator create. The editor will send them comp titles, which are comparable titles of, hey, this is the kind of place in the bookstore that I see this book. And hey, I like this trend in cover art, but I don't like that trend in cover art. And then the design department, whether they're working with an illustrator or they're creating from Gigi, you're making it hard to think. The design department, whether they're working with an illustrator or they are creating it from stock photography and, using a lot of typography or hand lettering or whatever, are going to start with just cover concepts. You might get a handful of cover concepts, you might get a couple. And that helps the editor, and sometimes they'll pass that along to the author and be like, what do you think? To get a sense of direction. Is this the vision that are they matching my vision? I'm talking a lot about editors having the vision for the book. And when the editor and the author are aligned on the vision of the book, the editor, like I said, is the advocate for the book in-house. And that includes getting a great cover. And so if the editor is like, hey, yeah, perfect, that is exactly what we were thinking, go with that. Then we're going to get a cover design from that. We're going to get samples for the interior. We're going to end up, once the book is copy edited, and we're going to get that in a minute, then they're going to typeset those the manuscript into the sample interior so that we end up with galleys, and we'll get that in a minute. But then let's talk about back to the line edit. Once the line edit, both the author and the editor are satisfied with the line edit being done, then it goes to copy editing. And the copy editor is always a separate person from the editor. I am also a copy editor, but I would never copy edit a book that I have been reading 5, 6, 7, 8 times. Because as I've been staring at that text and worrying about the big picture and then the little picture, I've been ignoring things that are smaller. I've been actively ignoring them because they don't matter yet. Now they matter. And I've been looking at that manuscript for so long, I'm probably missing them. And so that's why a separate pair of eyes is necessary. And that's where the copy editor comes in. They are the keen eye that you need for continuity errors, grammatical errors, syntax, all of those little things that when you as a reader read a book and you're like, where was the editor? Usually that's a copy editing error. And what that means is that multiple people looked at that book and missed that error. That is very common. The thing that I like to joke about privately is if you caught that, imagine how many errors there were before that one error got through. But also, people can have a very keen eye for detail and not be looking for it in the large, big process editorial process. And the copy editor might miss it too for whatever reason. That's called creating art by humans. And I think that those kinds of imperfections help us to understand that this is an art made by humans. So I also encourage a little grace when it comes to when you find errors in a published book. But a copy editor does their best to have that keen eye for detail to catch all of the errors that then won't end up in the published book. We talked about Galleys and ARCs. So when the typeset manuscript goes into Galleys, those are the first time that you see a manuscript actually looking like a book. It'll look a lot like this, only on printed out pages. Because it's now in InDesign or a similar typesetting program, and you can actually see your words as a book. And then we'll look at it together. The editor will look at it. The copy editor will slug it against not the copy editor, the managing editor in-house will slug it. The term is to slug it against the copy edit and make sure that all the copy edit changes have been made, and the author will review it and make sure that, there isn't anything big that has been missed. And then the book is published as an advanced reader copy, both digitally and sometimes in hard copy, because then it will go to various library shows like the American Library Association. Now that BookCon is back, it might go to a place like BookCon to be promoted there to readers directly. It will be sent to reviewers. That list of reviewers I was talking about, the professional reviewers, will get either a hard copy or a PDF, depending on their policies. And what I'm showing you here is on the spine, it'll say when it's being published. On the front, it says advanced reader's copy. And at some place on the book and in the book, it'll say uncorrected proof, not for sale. And it'll have all the publication information that you need for the marketing campaign and various other marketing information. This is a marketing piece that is sent out to reviewers and influencers to get people excited about the book before it comes out. This is where the marketing process comes into play in a traditional publishing house, marketing and PR, because there might be, for example, a press release, or PR might be trying to get the author onto a circuit to do interviews and trying to get them into, I don't know, like blog tours. And a bigger author might be like, maybe they're making the morning show circuit or the late show circuit. That doesn't happen for very many authors, obviously. But this marketing piece and other marketing materials are generated by editorial and the marketing department. Editorial is passing along these assets so that the marketing department can create bookmarks or postcards or digital ads that might go out in newsletters. For example, PW has a newsletter that might be advertised in. There are all sorts of ways that the marketing and PR department might be planning to promote a book at this stage. And they'll be working with the editorial team to be like, and it's a formal process in most houses where they'll have something called a launch, where editorial will present their books to the marketing and sales teams. And they'll be like, this is why this book is so important. This is why this book is so interesting. This is going to be so hot. Anything about the book to get the people in the marketing and sales departments excited about promoting this book to their accounts or to their connections. And so this in-house process is happening. Like I said, a lot of these things are happening parallel. And so you might be having a production meeting where marketing comes in every now and then and says, where are you with this book? Because we've got to meet a deadline to be able to get this book out to reviewers. We are here and we will have it to you by this time. And those kinds of coordination meetings happen all the time in publishing houses. So you've got the design process happening parallel to the editorial process, and the marketing process and PR comes in later. And eventually, all that culminates with, the book is sent out to the printer. The promotion is happening while the book is getting printed. And then you have publication day and the book comes out and everybody buys it and it's a bestseller, right? Right? No, not always. Let's back up, because that part of the marketing process, and editorial is part of this marketing process as well, because we're the people who know the book best. We are creating catalog copy, what's called sell sheets. And that sell sheet, some people call them TI sheets, title information sheets. It depends on the house. That information sheet, it becomes the basis for almost everything that is marketing the book later. So maybe 6 months before the book is published, those sell sheets are due. Editorial will have created the cover copy. They will have gotten the bio for the author. The cover is ready now, and they're putting all of that into a system that then gets put out into a feed where maybe marketing has planned a cover reveal, and they're going to have that information out there so that the book can be pre-ordered. And they're going to have, sometimes they'll have even physical catalogs or at least promotional sheets that they're going to be taking out on the road to whatever shows or meetings that they are having when you're talking about the salespeople, where they're going to be like, okay, here's our information. Nowadays, a lot of that is electronic, and there's a system called Edelweiss where all the catalogs are electronic. And I, as a bookseller, and this is where we get into how you decide as a bookstore what you're going to bring into your bookstore. And this is a process that might happen 6 months ahead of time, 4 months ahead of time, 3 months. I today am sending in my fall orders, and I am really late. Today is August 1st, and my fall orders all the promotions were like last month. So if I don't get my source books order in today, I don't get the promotional discount. So I've got to get it in. And so I'm looking at those catalogs on Edelweiss. I am looking at what my salesperson has flagged as this would be good for you because this kind of book sold well for you in the past, because they can see my sales data and my history. And I've told them, this is what my community is really going for right now. And so I will, as the bookstore, talk with my rep at the publishing company, the sales rep, and be like, what do you have for me? And I'll go through their catalog and I'll order ahead of time. And that process, we can get into it more in depth later as well, because this is getting to be a very long video. But I'm going through, I'm ordering, and then the books arrive. It's New Book Tuesday. We're making a stack. You see those every week now from us. These are the new books that came out. And that is part of our curation process, where we are deciding what works for us, works for our people. But also, people will be coming to us and saying, hey, can you order this for me? And we'll pay attention to that as well. So that is the publishing process. You go through submissions, you go through the editorial process. It's a big picture to little picture process. You've got marketing, you've got design and PR and sales and so forth happening all at the same time toward the end of that process. And then the book comes out and hopefully people will love it. But that is the life of a book. So if you have questions, if you have comments, again, this is the traditional publishing model. And there are so many people along the way that I forgot production, because the person that gets a book to the printer is the production department. The managing ed department works very closely with the production department, and they're the people that actually get the book printed. I glossed over that, but that's yet another person in that chain of people that make your book happen in a publishing company. So that is the traditional publishing process. And there are so many people, not just your editor, but all these other supportive people along the way who help to support your book and make sure that it is out there in the best way it can be possibly promoted and shared with the world. It's a very collegial project. I love working on books because I love how creative and dedicated all my colleagues are within this industry, and how much we work to make sure that every book that we work on is done as well as possible. And I hope that you see that care in every book that you see out on the bookstore shelves. Like I said, this is going to be a series. And so we're going to dive deep into every single one of these parts of the process, and parts of the process that I kind of glossed over today, like production. I think that I might be able to convince a production person to come on this podcast and talk to you all about the paper shortage, or, all the decisions that have to be made about whether you're going to have glossy or matte finish, or can you afford a really fancy paper? Those are all decisions that get made right before the book is printed that can be very fascinating as well, but also pretty complicated. So we will talk about this in depth throughout this series, and it's going to be ongoing. So if you have any questions about the publication process, about the writing process, about editorial, about design, about production, about marketing, ask them in the comments and we'll make a note of them for future episodes. Thank you so much for watching or listening to the Curious Cat Bookshop podcast. We'll see you next time. Bye.